Welcome to the final episode of Series 3 of Broadcasting Today, where we teach students here at Middlesex to learn how to think, but also how to do. This evening, we've got a press freedom debate led by Tala Sweiss, a third-year student here at Middlesex, with me, Kurt Barling, on the panel, Dominic Ponsford, the editor of the Press Gazette, and Harun, Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Welcome to the last edition of Broadcasting Today, the 7th in our series of Series 3. Today we've changed the format slightly. We're going to have a debate about press freedom, and rather than me ask the questions, it's going to be Tala Sweiss, third year undergraduate, who's going to lead the discussion. We also welcome here Dominic Ponsford, who's the editor of Press Gazette, and Harun, who's the Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Tala, take it away.
Okay, let's get right into it. So in January, there was an incident at Charlie Hebdo's office, and that reignited speculation about freedom of the press and freedom of speech. What is your insight on the issue?
I think from the Muslim community and MCB's perspective, the first thing we need to clarify is our condemnation of these horrific attacks. There's no question about that. So I think just to draw a line under that issue. In terms of press freedom, I think there's been a lot of discussion and debate about what is freedom of speech. From my view, everybody's entitled to freedom of speech, but not freedom to offend. So it's really understanding the difference between the two, understanding the sensitivities of people and their beliefs, and we live in a very tolerant society. So that's one of the key aspects of knowing when to make the distinction between freedom of speech and freedom to offend.
Dominic, do you think there's a point where journalism can cross a line?
Well, I think press freedom is a rose that you sort of have to grasp with its thorn, as Karl Marx once said, and that you can't just have a free press as long as it's things which don't offend you and which you broadly agree with. Having said that, is a cartoon worth putting your staff's lives at risk for? That's and your own life at risk. I guess that's a decision that an editor has to make according to their own conscience. Personally, I don't think I would have made that decision, but I respect their right to follow their own conscience on that.
Kurt, would you say that the media tend to overuse the term freedom of speech as justification for speaking about certain people?
I want to come back on this point really first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Tala, that Voltaire's been accredited as saying, "I will defend to the death the right for people to offend." I'm not sure it's quite accurate that it was him who said it. But there is a point at which you have to say, in the Charlie Hebdo case, is it right that causing offence should actually lead people to lose their lives? I mean, in a way, we're mixing up two things. There's a right to offend, and if we accept that there is a right to offend, then we have to accept that that is a right which extends to not being threatened with your life if you cause offence. There may be some other kind of sanction for your offence, and the law often provides sanction for that offence, but the idea that the press or a journalist can step across a line which will mean that ultimately if they lose their lives, then it's just tough. That's fundamentally wrong. I mean, we have to stand up for the right of journalists to publish. If they publish something which is offensive and breaks the law, then I think the law will take its course. And as a practicing journalist, I knew that if I offended people gratuitously, not just rich people and famous people and powerful people, but ordinary people, then I would, have to suffer the consequences of that. But never did I expect that the consequence would be a gun to my head. And there has to be a line where we accept that whatever the offence caused, there is never any justification for journalists losing their lives.
You said that you strongly condemn the acts, but do you agree with Kurt in that the consequences were a bit extreme?
I wouldn't say a bit extreme, they were very extreme actually. So I do agree with Kurt on that. I think on reflection, what I would say is that people do have a right to, I don't think offence is the right term, have the right to criticise. So if there's something to raise which is critical even of the religion, to have discussion and debate in a sort of, sort of good-mannered fashion like we're having here today. Let's have a discussion and a debate. What I fail to understand is what is the real objective of printing, say, a caricature of a religion which is followed by more than 1 billion people worldwide. What's the real objective of that? It's not really being critical or saying, there's something wrong in your religion, let's have a discussion and a debate. It's, that's the difficult bit to understand. And, we're all for discussion and debate and criticism, and I think even in the media, and very much, I think, Muslims and everyone actually benefit, especially in countries where there's a lot of restrictions on freedom of the press. It's the freedom of the press that's allowing those messages to come out where people are being oppressed. So that, it's a very critical part, and no way do we say that the press shouldn't have that freedom. But it's really trying to understand where those lines are drawn around going from discussion, debate and criticism to offending someone with really no basis whatsoever.
Dominic, to what extent do you think the British public, for example, value the freedom of the press?
Well, I think they value it a great deal. I mean, if you look at the trial result on Friday, we had four journalists from The Sun, 3-month trial at the Old Bailey, accused of corrupting public officials by paying for stories. And a jury decided that if the journalists did pay for those stories, they still wanted to acquit them because they felt that the public had a right to know what those journalists were telling us. So I thought that was a really telling moment. I think that that the public really do value press freedom perhaps more than we realise. And it's not just one trial where they've done that. There's been 9 journalists now acquitted by juries, even though they may have paid for stories, even though the prosecutors are telling them that's against the law, they've corrupted a public official. The juries have said no, we're going to acquit them because we think we've got a right to know about that, which I think is quite telling about the extent to which the British public kind of values a free press.
I think the British public can make a difference, differentiate between public officials who say, here's a way of making a fast buck or an extra buck, by selling some information, and the journalists who are using that information to report about something. I mean, I think, like Dominic says, I think that's quite a sophisticated understanding arrived at by those juries. Fundamentally, they're saying the press was right to publish. Actually, they weren't commenting on the people who were selling. And of course, those people who are selling have also been prosecuted for the selling. And that's another question. Of course, then there comes the question of, what about a whistleblower? But of course, a whistleblower, by and large, won't expect to be paid. They'll expect to have the information they provided put in the public domain, but they won't be expected to be paid. But fundamentally, the British public will defend, and they are defending essentially the right to the press and journalists publishing information which other people don't want them to have, because ordinarily it was a criminal offence.
Yeah. Following the Leveson inquiry, do you think perceptions about the press and the media and the general public and the right to know has changed at all?
Well, I think it's changed a great deal. I mean, and for the worse, since Leveson, I mean, there's a lot of things going on. So we've had the hacking scandal as well. Well, the hacking scandal preceded Leveson. Then we've had Leveson, and look at the way things have changed since then. We've had at least 64 journalists arrested in the UK for doing their jobs since the hacking scandal and since Leveson as well. Just last week we had a rule change from a government minister saying that if you're a state employee now, a civil servant, you've got to have the permission of a minister if you want to speak to a journalist. It's already the case that if you're a member of the armed forces, you need the permission of a press officer if you want to speak to a journalist. So journalists are pretty much becoming pariahs. You can't get near a journalist because if you're a policeman or a public official, because you'll somehow be corrupted by osmosis. So I think Leveson, albeit I'm sure with good intentions, has had the effect of really had a sort of stifling effect on press freedom in the UK in quite a dramatic way, and I think it's immensely worrying.
So, Kurt, would you say that it has tarnished the reputation of the journalism industry?
Not the whole industry. Let's get a perspective on this. That there were certain parts of the industry at the populist end, tabloid, for another, want of a better phrase, where certain practices were commonplace, and we now know they were commonplace. I think at the other end, with broadsheets, certainly with television and with radio, there wasn't that same there wasn't that same sense that all journalists acted in the same way. They clearly didn't. It certainly has tarnished the reputation of those populist newspapers. On the other hand, it might have tarnished their reputation, but people are still buying the papers. Yeah. I mean, the Daily Mail is still, isn't it, Dominic? Still is the largest selling newspaper?
Well, the Sun's the largest selling, and the Daily Mail is the most read if you include online. It's...
So people aren't shunning it, even though they recognise that sometimes the practices are perhaps slightly underhand. I mean, Harun, you and some of your colleagues have been victims of that, have you not?
Well, I think that's another whole area we could go into, really, about sensationalist headlines, which actually Muslims bear the brunt of. If you did any research, you'd see how much of it is. And the most recent one that we complained to, am I allowed to name the paper? I mean, it's public. The headline was in public, and we wrote to them as well. Yeah. So the Times, covering about Muslim sex grooming gangs, it was the headline, which is really concerning when, we're sort of having a very interesting discussion in the sense that, well, Kurt, you've just said that because of the Leveson inquiry, not, all journalists are bad. So in the same way, this same headline, paradoxically, is having the same effect, because you're saying Muslim sex grooming gangs, actually all Muslims are bad. So that's the kind of thing. So as soon as you add in the word Muslim, is that really, I don't want to go into that particular issue because that's a big debate in itself, but it's the use of headlines. And I think I see journalism as a huge responsibility, and I think with that, as a huge power, and with that power comes responsibility. It reaches people, it forms people's opinions. They take, what they read and what they see, that's where they form their opinions for many people. If we look at surveys around perceptions, and surveys around, and I mentioned at a previous event, there was a survey done where the general public in the UK, there was a poll done, how many Muslims do you think there are in the UK? And their perception is that it's 1 in 5, when in reality it's 1 in 20. So because of the negative perception that they see through the media being sort of fed out to them. So that it does form perceptions and misunderstanding.
So Dominic, do you agree with that? Do you think that's probably because there's not enough regulation in the system?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a common complaint that journalists are preoccupied with sort of negative stories and negative news, but unfortunately everything's fine and dandy, and life went on as normal yesterday across the UK is not a story, but something awful happened in the UK yesterday is a story. And so, I suppose with these, the grooming gangs, terrible story, an awful thing, but it has to be covered, and the other things that are going on with people going off to join ISIS. I mean, it is news, and I guess journalists have got to, got a duty to report the news. That said, totally take on board they're not always going to get it 100% right, and that you're going to get headlines wrong every now and again, and that journalists have got to respond to that. Personally, I think standards are improving. I think, although I was very critical of Leveson, there's a new regulator coming now called the Independent Press Standards Organisation, IPSO, which is actually showing signs of being pretty tough so far. So for the first time now, if you make a page 1 mistake, it will say you've got to have a page 1 correction, which never happened before. And I would just say from my reading of the industry and from talking to people, I think that the most newspapers are signed up to it, so most of them that are in there are actually taking it very seriously and they're getting corrections in quicker and taking that sort of thing more seriously.
Would you agree?
I think that the newspapers, well, it's too early to say how effective the new regulator is going to be. It's really early days. But if the new regulator exercises real teeth, if it makes, for example, a page 1 mistake, a page 1 correction, and that sticks, particularly on the more offensive one, let's see how this one goes with the Times. Let's see what happens if the regulator goes to the regulator and says, oh, well, yes, actually, that headline was a bit salacious or sensational. You really should make amends on page 1. Well, let's see if they have another kind of headline on page 1, and then we'll know that actually that part of the regulatory framework is having an impact on holding the press to account, because that's ultimately what it's about, isn't it? It's actually challenging the press, making sure that the press doesn't get away with saying anything just because they're the press and say, well, we need press freedom to say whatever we want. If they're accountable, which is the whole point about the hacking scandal, was that people didn't feel that the press was accountable. If you make the press more accountable, then people will presumably believe that press freedom is worthwhile, because with the freedom comes a responsibility to be held accountable.
Yeah.
Perhaps they have to pay more fines or something like that. Maybe that's money. Fear of losing money, that's the thing that concentrates people's mind.
Yeah, more and more people are using social media to access news, and obviously news organizations are doing the same by providing that news. Do you think it's more difficult to regulate social media, because anybody can say whatever they want?
Very much. I think there is almost no regulation of social media. If you read some of the comments, I'm quite shocked actually when I see some of the comments, and especially in terms of hate crime, and not necessarily just towards Muslims, I'm talking in general. Even if you go onto David Cameron's Twitter page and you see some of the vile comments that people are making, it's almost, and I think it's more to do with the fact that you're not seen, so they know no one's really going to follow them up, and they're sort of, they're not on camera or anywhere else, not live situation, they're just saying what they want to say. And I think this probably brings us back to the whole point around being offensive, that these are offensive comments. If they were constructive or critical, but these are purely offensive, hate-driven comments across all communities, it doesn't matter who it is, and very difficult to control on social media. And the other phenomenon we're seeing with social media is this whole push to, for young people to go to ISIS. Yeah. It's very much driven through the internet, very difficult to control. And I think young people are very vulnerable to this kind of engagement, because you can't, we don't want to be in a society which is all controlled. But there's a real challenge here, I think, for society to find a way around it.
Yeah, well, I think Twitter should take more responsibility for what they're publishing. Really, they're very happy to take the advertising and the lovely investment money they're getting. And they're really a massive competitor now for sort of people that employ organisations that employ journalists and that take a lot of care over what they're publishing. So I think Twitter should take what it publishes more seriously. Not just be allowed to publish, absolutely anything, no matter how hateful or destructive or upsetting, without impunity.
Of course, they're not immune to the law. I mean, and we've seen from recent trolling cases, of course, it's a massive task.
But most of them think they are immune. That's the issue.
Yeah, but you get a couple of people. I mean, I did a story for the One Show where one of the first really serious cases of trolling, where the abuse was unbelievable, of this young feminist activist, unbelievable, and the police caught 2 or 3 people. Obviously, they weren't the brightest ones, because the really bright ones have covered their tracks, but the less bright ones had left their tracks wide open. They were prosecuted and sent to prison. So actually, the law can have an impact, although it is much more dependent on the person who's been targeted raising a complaint. But in a way, that's the same as any other attack, any other physical attack or attack on an individual. You have to make the complaint for the law to respond to it. So I think there still are mechanisms, but I agree with Dominic, actually. Twitter making packets of money, they should exercise some sense of editorial responsibility in the same way as the Press Gazette does, or the BBC does, or whoever else does. They should be held to account for that. The law seems a bit grey on that at the moment.
Yeah, and you also got to somehow educate the general public as well, the users, because not everyone who goes on Twitter has got a degree in journalism, so they don't realise there's an ongoing trial. They might tweet something which they've heard from a few months ago that's in breach of all sorts of court orders, and they can actually end themselves up in prison. Literally in prison, just for doing one tweet about tweeting one person's name who's the subject of an injunction. So it's big job to educate the users of social media as well.
So that's where obviously the issue of citizen journalists can come into play, because they're unaware of the law and they obviously don't have a degree in journalism, for example, so they don't know what's right and what's wrong, and therefore surely it's very difficult to regulate.
It comes down to responsibility, I think, for the individual. If they, like Kurt said, I think the law is already there, so in terms of hatred, in terms of death threats, etc., people know these laws. General people would know what's permitted, what's not permitted, and I think if they're not wise enough to really do something silly, and they've been caught out, as Kurt said, it's rightly so. Some of them have, many others haven't. I think on Facebook it's probably worse to some extent, less controlled, especially sort of right-wing hatred, the kind of comments that come out. So there is someone who's going to monitor it. So they can monitor it, the providers, the facilitators can monitor it, or the individual who feels aggrieved then makes a complaint, etc., and follows through a process around. But it's almost unconstrained in a sense, the rate at which it's happening.
Kurt, have you experienced any ethical problems in terms of like social media and stuff like that?
Well, obviously I reported for the One Show on the trolling case. Certainly as a journalist, you're always faced with ethical dilemmas. One that Harun is really familiar with is the reporting I did in the early noughties on Abu Hamza. And I was faced with a real dilemma about what I could say in the public domain about what I discovered undercover, when I was an undercover journalist, or had an undercover production on going inside Finsbury Park Mosque. Desperately difficult situation, because I could see, my instinct and my judgment told me what was happening was wrong, and that if this was happening anywhere else, young people there watching videos which, if I'd been shown in my sons and daughters' school or church or synagogue, there would have been outrage. And here there was no way of saying to people, this is going on right now. And it was a real dilemma for me. Eventually we overcame that, and we made sure we had lawyers all over the paperwork, all over the footage, to make sure that we weren't breaking any laws. As it was, there was a threat of me being sued for defamation, but that kind of drifted away once we presented the material and it was sort of incontrovertible. So yes, and I'm sure Dominic's faced similar things as a journalist, where sometimes you know that you have a right to document, you have a right to report, but you have a responsibility to do it responsibly.
I mean, probably my biggest dilemma I face as an editor, and bring it back to where we began, was actually the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. And it was a terrible week of soul searching that, when really once the memorial edition came out, and they put the front page, which was a depiction of the Prophet, millions and millions of copies of it, all over the place. It's out there. Nothing's going to stop it from being out there. So, point of principle, what do you do? Do you report the news that this millions of copies of this thing is out there? It's the biggest story of the week. It's almost impossible to tell the story without showing the front page. But at the same time, there's a risk, however tiny, that some crazy person could take offence at what we've done, walk into my offices and kill someone completely innocent, not me, or just a colleague. So it was. I must say, my instinct at the time was that we should document it in some way. Even I think once the BBC did it on the lunchtime news, they showed the pile of magazines.
Yeah.
I felt that we should do a still of that programme, and that sort of covers it for us. But it wasn't really my decision to make. As editor, I felt I had to bring in other people from the company, and I think as a company we decided no, we're not going to do it. And funnily enough, I phoned my mum that night, and she just said, "Don't be so bloody stupid. What are you thinking about? Why'd it even cross your mind?" And I thought, well, actually, Mum, maybe you're right. God, I don't know. And I must say, a few months, we were talking about before we came on, but a couple of weeks ago, there was some new research that came out that revealed the extent to which Muslims in the UK genuinely are upset by that sort of thing. I think it was 3/4 of British Muslims, said that they would find it personally distressing to see that image, portrayed in the media. And I think I wasn't alive to the extent to which actually people found that genuinely upsetting. So I think that's kind of made me think again about it. I think I might have come to a different view today.
That's a good point. Probably there's a couple of things there. One is the fact that I think as a community we probably haven't really conveyed the message that this is where the Prophet is, his status is in terms of our religion. Yeah. And also just on the other point around the distribution of it even within the UK, the MCB, Muslim Council of Britain, actually we released a statement signed by 50 imams actually endorsing the fact that what we were saying was that we are offended, but those of us who are offended don't react. So you've got a sense of responsibility. We live in a law-abiding country, and this is not the way of the Prophet to react in such a violent manner. And that actually went a very long way. It got picked up well by the media. We got our message across that actually we are offended, and this is not what we do. But at the same time, we're not going to do anything violent, and nor should anyone else. So it was a good lesson learnt. There was a series of events that followed through from there as well, sort of opening up more, letting people understand what Islam is and what the Muslims believe. And I think that's an education process really for everyone really to understand, because unless, I think sometimes it's out of ignorance as well, people don't really understand. It's a cartoon, what's the big deal? Yeah. Just like everything else, it's caricature. If they don't really understand the sensitivities, so there is some degree of education needed, I think, in the whole process.
So Kurt, to what extent would you encourage, for example, current journalism students to be bold and brave with whatever they say?
Not break the law.
Not break
bold
the
and
law.
brave,
Yeah.
yes, definitely. You have to be bold. But no one wants to be a journalist. You've got to be bold and brave anyway, because you're obviously pitching stories all the time, and you never know whether you're going to have success with that. If you're an investigative type journalist and you want to identify problems in society, you want to provide a pathway to a resolution, then you've got to be bold and brave. But I'm in Harun's camp on this, that I don't think you should gratuitously offend people in order to make your point. I still don't think you should lose your life if you do gratuitously offend somebody, but you have to be bold and brave as a journalist to get to the bottom of things. How can you do? I can always remember somebody in the BBC who remained nameless saying to me when I was quite a young journalist, so Kurt, here you are coming into my office and you're very bold, Kurt, and you're very in my face. I think you need to calm down a bit. And I turned around and I said, listen, you expect me to go out there and talk to the Prime Minister or a general or a mother who's lost her child in some tragedy, and you want me to be a shrinking violet? I don't think that's going to work, you know. I've got to be up front. And if I'm going to be up front with them, I've got to be up front with you too. So bold and brave, I'm afraid, is the nature of the beast if you're going to be a successful journalist.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say so, Dominic? Isn't that? Am I making a caricature?
No, I mean, I'd say. Well, I think it's it gets the nub of it really. The Daily Mail editor Paul Dacre did we quoted him in Press Gazette this week actually, saying that, you know, what makes a good journalist is someone who knows when to be bold and knows when to be careful. But, you know, he said any fool can do either. Yeah. But getting that balance right is the tough thing. And I think, you know, Daily Mail is a pretty good example of a paper that does know when to be bold and when to be careful. So, you know, they published that famous front page naming the killers of Stephen Lawrence all those years ago, which was, you know, one of the bravest things I think any journalist has ever done, because they didn't know whether they were not only whether they could get sued, they could have committed a sort of a criminal contempt of court with that. But yeah, and then you take the Daily Mail as one of the papers which chose not to republish the Charlie Hebdo front page. They chose to be careful there. So I think it just gets to the nub of it. But I think unless you are going to be sort of bold and courageous every now and again, it would be a bit of a boring job, wouldn't it? Really, you know, you got you know, you got and I think, you know, the job of the journalist, and you know, the great thing about tabloid journalism in this country is it sort of pushes the edges, and it does, you know, sometimes it pushes it too far, and it's, you know, sometimes it causes offence. But you know, I think it's a great tradition that they are willing to break the rules and kind of push it as far as they still do.
Harun, would you feel that, for example, broadcasters such as BBC and Sky News would feel, I mean, not forced, but would feel compelled to, for example, depict the photo of the cartoons to help tell their story more? Because obviously it's not like newspapers where you can use a lot of words. It's different. You have a different audience.
I don't think it's necessary to actually show the picture or depict it. I think having that discussion, just referring to a depiction or a caricature, is sufficient. I think there were some issues with the BBC where it was apparently shown in a background screen, and then you know, some people complained, and you know, how could there be, and then they changed their guidelines around what they can and can't show. But again, it comes down to what's the real purpose? What's the benefit of this caricature and showing the Prophet? I can understand caricature of politicians, you know, going back to the days of Spitting Image, you know, which was a good laugh. And again, I think as a person, and I'm sure some of those politicians were probably very offended. But they're
What you would have looked like on Spitting Image.
Don't start, you look better than me. But it's going back a while. But and then obviously you've got numerous cartoons, etc., and so on. But when you're talking about a religious figure who's, you know, revered throughout time, and you know, the status of the Prophet is immediately after God, you know, for us, even more than our parents. So if the Pope even said, you know, I mean, his words were, if somebody did that of my mother, you know, I'd punch them. I mean, obviously that's almost inciting violence in a sense, but that's not what we say. I think it's really important. It's probably just to put the emphasis on the sort of sanctity of that position. So it's really important, and I think if we really want sort of a society which is engaged and in dialogue and can lead to some sort of good constructive dialogue, that's probably not the best way to go about it.
You know, I think there's a real myth that the press is free to do whatever it likes, and I don't know where that myth has evolved from. Partly because there is a lot of criticism of the press in Britain, open criticism of the press and journalists, but it's not the case that the press is completely free to do whatever. There's a whole raft of regulation, not just people ending up in courthouses because they bought material from public officials or they've been involved in illicit hacking. You know, there's a whole raft of things which means that a journalist can find themselves in front of a judge, and in front of a judge might end up in prison. Northern Ireland, it went on for years with journalists wanting to, you know, not reveal their sources and the state wanting to reveal their sources. So the idea that it's almost in this age of celebrity where it's that notion of protecting the privacy of individuals, where this whole press notion that the press has got unfettered freedom has sort of built into a mythological proportion. But actually, there's an awful lot of things, as you well know, Tala, because you've done the courses, you've done the law courses, that there are certain things you simply can't do as a journalist. And I think that's true in the real world as much as it is in the classroom, isn't it, Dominic?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the stuff we've been doing, covering the various court cases going on of journalists who are accused of paying public officials, there's a list of injunctions as long as your arm, the things you can't mention, names you can't mention, things I can't even mention that I can't mention. You know,
what is it you can't mention?
I don't know how to explain it, but there are matters going on at the moment which I can't even mention. I can't even mention are going on. You know, and the you know, look at the you know, libel and privacy. You know, you have to be very careful about what you write about. You know, especially if that's a rich person who could sue you. Because even if you're 100% sure of your ground in your story, you don't want to spend the next 2 years of your life tied up in an incredibly expensive libel case proving that point. And you know, the costs of defending libel actions are so huge in the UK that for a small publication like we've got, you know, we have to be incredibly careful. So there's a degree of sort of self-censorship that goes on. So, you know, we've got, you know, it is a half-free press in the UK anyway. There's no way we've got, you know, complete freedom to do what we like.
To our audience, does anybody have any questions? Well,
my question is for Dominic. I just want, because you just mentioned how journalists are getting sued and by rich people, and I've spoken to another journalist who also talks about this problem, how sometimes when she's writing her column, she always gets like threatened and sometimes asked by her editor, no, let's not do this. So how do you think journalists are going to become this kind of the power of rich people being able to sue journalists when they know they should tell the story?
Well, you've got to be very brave, you know, and luckily we've got some very brave journalists in the UK, and it helps if you work for a news organisation that's got very deep pockets, and luckily there's still a couple of those left. I mean, we gave an award at Press Gazette last year to a guy called Michael Gillard, who exposed a gangster called David Hunt. Now, David Hunt had eluded the police for decades, but the Sunday Times had the guts to basically call him what he was, which was a gangster. So the Gillard and the Sunday Times got dragged through the courts for years on that. Cost them hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds, you know. And Gillard himself now still has personal security issues because of doing that story. So you know, you've got to be tremendously brave, haven't you? But then I think what I try to do, I mean, God, I'm not saying I'm as brave as Michael Gillard, but what I try to think about is the hundreds of journalists around the world who not only risk maybe losing their jobs or losing a bit of money, but they risk losing their lives. You know, the journalists have become a target now around the world in a way that they never were before. And you know, there's some very, very brave journalists in places like Sri Lanka and you know, Syria and elsewhere around the world, where just writing the truth about the government will get you killed or get you shot. You know, so I think we need to remind ourselves of that in this country, and also remind ourselves of that in the UK has a reputation for sort of leading the world in this sort of thing, and that if we let standards slip here, then other countries will look to that.
I think, I mean, as a journalist, as a practicing journalist, I've always found that if you're secure on the ground you stand, you can afford to be brave. Yes, you will take some flack. You will take, you know, somebody at the end, oh, Kurt, you know that story you were going to do, well, maybe you should think about changing that slightly. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, but I think my editor now wants me to publish it that way. You know, you have to stand your ground. You have to learn to stand your ground. And when you start off as a journalist, of course, you get all sorts of people trying to put pressure on you, but the longer you persist and the longer you stay in the field, the more, it's not even brave really, the more secure you feel in trusting yourself and trusting your own judgment. And there are plenty of editors out there still who will back you if they, if you're a good journalist. So I don't think you need to be overly fearful, but you said careful.
Careful,
Always
yeah.
careful.
I think integrity is a good commodity in journalism as well. So you're not going to, it'll make you employable, because integrity and backbone are two things which editors, all editors like to see. So I've not seen journalists who show integrity and background do badly out of it. They do well out of it in the long term.
Any other questions?
I think there's a sort of confusion between talking about the journalistic accuracy of reporting about, for instance, Islam, and the lazy journalism of talking about Muslim grooming or whatever, and I think you're absolutely right when you make that point. But with something like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, we're talking about comedy. Whether you find those cartoons funny or not is another issue, but I remember growing up in Canterbury when Life of Brian, the Monty Python film, was banned in Canterbury by the council as offensive to Christians. I objected to that very strongly, despite growing up in a Christian family and attending a Christian school, because I found the film outrageously funny, and still do. And it's not about criticising something or making a polite debate, it's about amusing people, essentially. I mean, there are satirical things in the film, but I think essentially it's a comedy, and that's its main purpose. So I think to talk about the Charlie Hebdo cartoons simply in terms of a polite debate might be missing the point, at least from my point of view.
It's a good point. I think from our perspective, and actually Life of Brian is just as offensive to Muslims, because Jesus is just as revered by us as are all the prophets mentioned in the Bible and the Quran. It's just that I think from a religious perspective, the belief is so strong and so close to us in terms of our respect for the Prophet. It's very difficult for Muslims, and with the sheer number of Muslims across the world, throughout their life, that respect is there, and which is unfortunate, I think, for say the filming of Life of Brian, and actually the way Prophet Jesus is caricatured. Muslims haven't sort of lost that value of their Prophet, mainly Prophet Muhammad. So they still sort of make a very strong point around his depiction, or even making satire on him. I don't think there's a problem with comedy shows about Muslims per se, just in general. And I've seen a few of those here and there. You see, and there's a good job, and you have Muslim comedians even now as well. Just like you have, it's interesting actually. So a lot of people are covered by law. This is the thing. So you've got race laws, you've got discrimination laws, you've got laws on anti-Semitism. But the interesting debate, probably for another day, is how is it?
I've got a minute left on.
How is it that we can make jokes and caricature from amongst our own? So you could have a black comedian making black jokes, but I don't think you would have a white comedian making black jokes.
You have to be a good comedian.
It wouldn't be funny, so it would be insulting, and you'd be verging. It'd be a very uncomfortable place to be. And the same with Muslims. I've seen stand-up comedians, joke about, it's more about the culture rather than the religion, because what you have as well is the mix of ethnicity and culture thrown in the mix. So it's not the same for every Muslim having the same kind of issues and to be made fun of. So there is some element of that, but I think that's where the key issue lies around laws of discrimination and the protection that it provides, where Muslims are actually excluded from that protection.
On that note, I think it's time to say thank you to our guests, to Harun
Thank you.
Khan and Dominic Ponsford.
Thank you very
for
much.
coming all the way to Middlesex
Thank you.
to have
Thank
this conversation about press freedom. Long may it last.
Indeed.
Because without it, we will be a much poorer community. Thank you to the audience for being with us for the season, and for you out there who've watched us for this Series 3. Series 4 will be back in October 2015. Bye for now.